Hello, my name is Hannah Smith. I am in CIED 5370, Section 3, Dr. Cregan. The focus of my study will be the impact of students properly self-assessing their writing. In Chapter 1, I will discuss the background of the problem, purpose, research questions, assumptions, limitations, and delimitations. The background of the problem is simple. Self-assessment is a constant for a writer. Writers are forced to look back at their writing and ask themselves, does this make sense? And the students must learn how to look at a prompt, assess what they know about it, and then complete a composition that will be assessed with a scoring rubric. This all contains the aspect of self-assessment. A writer uses this consistently throughout the writing process. As they write, they have to look back and see if they are meeting the criteria that is given to them. So the purpose of this study is to determine how well the researcher's students self-assess their writing. Research questions will be to what degree do the researcher students properly self-assess their writing? And what benefits can students incur from properly self-assessing their writing? This will be the main focus of the study because self-assessment is so important to a writer. The assumptions are that it is assumed that all students took a sufficient amount of time assessing their writing. And it is also assumed that the students understood how to use the student-friendly rubric. So if I, as the researcher, properly informed them how to use the rubric, and if I gave them enough time to assess their writing, then it is assumed that these results will be accurate. The limitations of this study are that the researcher will be the one assessing the compositions from the students, so there could be a grading bias. As the researcher, I have studied these students' writing all year long. I will have seen the progress, so there could be a grading bias as I look through their papers and see if I accidentally grade on progress instead of grading on the work that is actually in front of me. If the students are not properly trained on how to use the rubric, the scores could be skewed. So again, if they did not understand the directions or the wording of the rubric, this could cause issues with the scores. And the students are still novice writers, and they may struggle with finding errors in their own writing. These are fourth graders who have just been introduced to writing in general this year. So with them not having sufficient amount of skills, they could have trouble noticing what errors they made in their writing and what they are accomplishing and doing well in. The delimitations is that this study only applies to the fourth grade students at New Waverly Intermediate School in the New Waverly School District. And this study lacks the ability to be duplicated with the exact participants. So the makeup of my classroom cannot be recreated anywhere else. So this study is key to my future instruction and can only be helpful to others. In Chapter 2, I will address the literature that was used as research on self-assessment, rubrics, and then I will read to my conclusion. Self-assessment is when you look at a set criterion and use it to evaluate your work. Research shows that self-assessment leads to higher achievement for students. So if they're able to properly self-assess their work, later on they're going to be able to take that self-assessment skill and use it in other areas of their lives and schooling. Writing is a self-assessing and self-regulated task. I, as the educator, cannot go to a student and make them write. This is something that they have to do on their own. And when they're revising and editing, I can add my comments and my suggestions, but they still have to self-assess on their own to see if they are meeting my criteria. Self-assessment allows students to make meaningful connections to their world through reflection. So self-assessment is reflection. They look back and say, oh, I really did this well, or maybe I'm still struggling here, maybe I need more help in this. And students can't just look at a rubric with a set criterion and see what they should have done better in their writing. They need both good and bad examples to compare to their writing. That is how they self-assess. They can read an example and say, oh, mine is similar to this, or maybe I should have added more like this example has. The task for writing teachers is to help the students understand that the information received from these self-assessments should be used to improve their writing. So not only is it a student's responsibility to assess their writing, they also need to learn how to take the information that they've learned from that self-assessment and that rubric and say, okay, where can I go from here? What can I take from this assessment and go to my next assignment and use? Rubrics. Rubrics are key to the study. According to Turley and Gallagher, the first writing rubrics were created in the early 1900s. And rubrics were created to be used as a universal way to grade. It was also mentioned that they were used and created to be similar to a thermometer, as so that it can be universal and used everywhere. Little has changed in the way rubrics are used in an official capacity. The STAR written composition scoring rubric is a universal scoring rubric that is used across the state to use to grade the students across the state. So there's no differentiation in these rubrics. And rubrics are a way to measure the student's progress and achievement without solely focusing on the student's weaknesses. So a student can look at a rubric and say, oh, I am meeting these criteria in this area, but maybe I'm still a little bit lower here, but look at what my strengths are. Look at what I can do. So rubrics also allow everyone who is involved in the student's achievement to understand what the student is excelling in and what they are still needing to practice. As an educator, I'm asked all the time from parents and fellow educators, what can I do to help this student with this assignment, with this writing? Well, they look at the rubric and say, okay, this is the set criteria for this assignment. Let's look and see if you have any of these aspects in your paper. So this allows a communication between fellow educators, parents, and guardians to help those students when they are struggling with their work. The conclusion of the literature research was that while looking through the research, it is clear that self-assessment through the use of rubrics can have exponentially effective outcomes for students. It allows for reflection opportunities and gives students the meaningful connections that will last throughout their lifetime. Chapter 3, the research methods. This is still a work in progress. It will have the research design, participants, variables, data collection instruments, and the procedures. The research design is a quantitative study conducted through the use of a self-assessment rubric. The participants will be fourth graders at New Waverly Intermediate School in New Waverly ISD. The breakdown is not available yet, but it will be once the study is. The variables will be gender and writing skills, and the data collection instrument will be the self-assessment rubric created and inspired by the STAR written composition scoring rubric. So this rubric that is shown on the screen is created by using the actual TEA issued scoring rubric that is used to grade the written composition assessment of the STAR exam. So I used student-friendly language so that they understood what was being asked of them, and it's easier language for them to use when looking at their work. It also has the TEKs that are connected to to each section, and has the exact same criteria for from the actual TEA issued. The procedures will be that the students will self-assess their expository composition using the rubric. The researcher will grade the composition using the rubric without seeing the scores and that the students gave their papers. The researcher will then compare the results to determine how many students properly self-assessed their writing.